Welcome back to Trending in Education. Brandon Jones, Michael Palmer, and myself, Dan Strafford, back with you. And on today's episode, we'll talk about cryptomnesia and more. Mike, how are you? Do you remember how you're doing?
I'm good. And just to be clear, it's cryptomnesia.
Oh, sorry.
It's not cryptomnesia. It's cryptomnesia. So cryptomnesia, multiple discovery, some interesting concepts, particularly if you're trying to understand the zeitgeist, trying to understand who comes up with a new idea, how do you get credit for coming up with a new idea. I thought were interesting ideas for us to talk about, and hence we're having a bit of that kind of conversation. Brandon, any what's happening in your neck of the woods?
I think it's necessary to say that I felt like I had this idea, and then only to find out, and we have like email evidence of this that in fact you had this idea, but in a manner that is speaks to this very show topic. I think that that can happen at any time with any subject.
And Mike, the correct pronunciation as you gave there, cryptomnesia, defined as a couple of different ways, but from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, is the idea that the way our brain works, the inadvertent copying or relaying of a thought that you had previously heard. So forgetting that you had heard it and then presenting it as new to a new group of people or on a paper, or I've likened it to stand-up comedians, I think probably suffer from this in a large majority. But is that a fair way to sort of categorize this topic?
Yes, and it comes up a lot within the context of plagiarism. So
Right.
like if somebody's, or like intellectual property. So like somebody comes up with something, acts as though it's their own. Cryptomnesia is a documented psychological phenomenon. So the American Psychological Association, the APA, does talk about cryptomnesia as a thing. That said, I do think it's a bit of an excuse. So like when you're caught pretending to come up with something, it's easy to claim cryptomnesia. So it's like, what had happened was I heard that a few years ago and forgot about it. But now, turns out I want to credit the original inventor, discoverer of the idea. But I just thought it was an interesting topic for us to talk about as we try to, spot trends and identify when new ideas are emerging. In some ways, it almost argues for not the first time an idea is identified. It's more when more people start to identify it in parallel. In some ways, cryptomnesia and then multiple discoveries, the other related idea, I think they signal that an idea is bigger than maybe a one-off or the concept of a singleton.
Yeah, agreed. I also think there's a question of intentionality here, right? And this is to your point where it can be used as an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
But discerning that intentionality is really difficult. So one of the things just in reading through this article, it says a couple times, basically everything that's created is borrows from something in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, when you're thinking about some really fresh piece of writing, all of the words in it are borrowed, right?
Yep.
Maybe it's ordered in some way, or maybe it's reminiscent of some other piece of work, but does, borrows from it in a new and novel way. And that's seen as excellence in one's craft,
Mm-hmm.
Being able to tether back to things that exist in the zeitgeist. But when it's sort of word for word and unattributed and willful, I guess the willful part is the really hard thing to measure. Right? Because this cryptomnesia suggests that there are things that are picked up inadvertently and that you really truly believe that you came up with it.
Right.
But you can also go and plagiarize knowingly, right? So it's it's interesting to try to figure out how you discern intentionality.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing just in our moment in time right now with all of the way that fake news and when you're posting something that you believe to be true turns out to be false, are you a bad actor versus posting something to be false?
Mm-hmm.
I think all of this is sort of in that same general swirl.
Yeah, agreed. And it's the same idea around TLDR too. It's and first, so first, that's my idea. First, I came up with it first. even if it wasn't as well thought out, like I got out first, therefore I win. So like when speed beats depth, like that frequently is sort of the age that we're in, and like if you can curate something, like position an idea out there, in some ways you're elevated in that process. And then cryptomnesia, I still think it's almost like kleptomnesia, because like the etymology is interesting, but like it does feel like it's almost like an unconscious theft of an idea. But I think cryptomnesia is a more gentle way of putting it. But to me, it also speaks to the very fundamental problem of journalism that we're facing nowadays too, where it's like, what is journalism? Like, is it writing a good headline and getting the most clicks, or is there a level of depth to sort of the narrative and the positioning that you can put out there? I just think we're in a very interesting time. The other related trend on the journalistic front is I've been following Seth Abramson a lot, who's now positioning himself as a curatorial journalist, which is really more about curating, mainly through Twitter, but through other formats, other people's posts and content, and how that's actually like an emerging capability, but it's not actually like creating novel ideas yourself.
Right.
You're more like packaging and positioning the ideas of others.
Yeah, but I think that's that is a real thing, right?
Mhm.
And so you think about like the place that is most evocative for me is in museum shows, right?
Sure.
Like you're not like a museum curator or someone presenting a show is not herself creating any of the art, right? But she's organizing it in a way and, with sort of a spatial experience for the viewer that is telling a novel story or is telling a specific story. And so I think there is creativity and art in that very exercise, despite the fact that like the actual pieces are, not hers.
Yeah. And that's why to me, the concept is really interesting, because like there's the notion that creativity is a singular activity, and that like the individual who comes up with the idea owns it, versus the idea of creativity in sort of the modern era, like our contemporary times, is more about sort of assimilating and co-opting and combining the ideas of others. And I think that's why cryptomnesia was an interesting concept for me to stumble onto, in that like I feel like it's almost holding people accountable to like an older standard of like, my ideas will be sort of de novo in my own mind. Like I will just generate these ideas independent of any other inputs. And I just don't think that's how the mind actually works. So I feel like the almost over ascription of ownership to ideas and inventions is like a natural human, it's the way we tell the story.
Right.
But I don't know if it's as beneficial to our understanding of what creativity is, what inventiveness is. Like, how do you sort of break old molds and come up with new ideas?
I think that's right. I think there's a continuum, right? Where like if you take some truly novel piece of artwork, let's say, as one end of the spectrum, is something that's clearly been created by someone.
Mm-hmm.
And at the other end of the spectrum, you take something that is just straight plagiarism. So you've got a fourth grader who has a book report on the Battle of Gettysburg, and she turns in just the Gettysburg Address, just word for word, right? Like
no quotes,
just like that's for word by word, that is the entirety of her book report.
Yeah.
Like that feels like intentional and plagiaristic.
Yes.
But what if she takes all of that and then says, this is real deep, right? Like she has just a tiny dollop of her own commentary.
Right.
Does like at what point does that become actually an act, a work of new creation?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And like, how are you discerning where that line is, and then how are you discerning intentionality? Because what I continue to take from this is it's the unwitting part, right? So like we don't know when we're doing this. We really believe, like there was the research study that was shown where they had people they had different groups of students, they had people create things, and then they had them recall, and like 75% of the students recalled having created that, in fact, having created something that in fact someone else did.
Right.
So unless you got 75% of the population who's just straight liars,
Right.
which maybe that's right. It's like there's something that this is a real phenomenon. Like you're actually forgetting that this wasn't coming from you.
Well,
where on that spectrum does that line fall?
I think you're exactly right, Brian, with the intentionality question of, in today's age, dealing with what we have, what you're doing with that information. If you're a journalist or you're a writer or you're a comedian or you're a musician, is it incumbent upon you when you have this fresh idea to go and search out if anyone's done it before? Like, is it incumbent upon an author to make sure they're not just, remembering something when in fact it's not a fresh idea? Or is it incumbent on the editor, or is it incumbent on the person buying the product to say, oh, these are the same? This keeps coming in my brain of music. You had Sam Smith and Tom Petty, right? Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers sued Sam Smith for his song because it was note for note. I forget. I Won't Back Down, I think. Well, it was the song that was compared. And how do we judge that? And to your point, Brent, what's the intention there? Did Sam Smith knowingly write down a song that he knew was note for note, just slower, I Won't Back Down? Or did he hear that when he was 12 and have it somewhere inside him and write this song that ended up being? It's a tough line to draw, and understanding exactly where that is and whose responsibility it is to determine whether something already exists.
I think it's interesting. I think we see if you'll buy this. I'm not sure you will, but by virtue of you, the listener, listening to this podcast, this very podcast, like your burden of identifying your own authenticity has now gone up.
Right.
You're hearing from us who've been mildly educated on this topic,
at least
that you may not be a objective witness of your own acquisition and then production of, call it, content, that you may actually be plagiarizing.
Right.
And so I think the onus is now even more on you to make sure that you're not doing that, if in fact you care not to do that, or you just have like really hone your argument about how the act of plagiarism is in fact a new form of creation.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And also how much time needs to be spent referencing prior ideators too. So like there's a point at which, I was looking up the list. If you want to just get some kicks, look at the list of multiple discovery on Wikipedia, where you realize, over the last 2,000 years, just about anything that was invented or discovered anywhere was also invented and or discovered in somewhere else right about the same time, which to me is an indication that the ideas are ready, and it just takes several of us to be playing with our head up to be able to identify, hey, this idea is new and exciting. What's interesting, though, to me nowadays, getting back to your example of the third grader, is if she's a thinkfluencer and she has a lot of followers,
right?
Suddenly her idea is more important than the kid whose parents are raising them off social media, no following. So the only people who hear the kid who's not in the social formats are the kids who are in the room. And then if ultimately the thinkfluencer, that's a word, right?
It is now.
Kind of a word.
Hashtag.
Make it up, or have you heard it?
I may have kleptomnesiaed it.
Yeah.
But like the idea that once somebody of quote unquote influence promulgates that idea, suddenly it catches fire. It's a trend. We're talking about it as a concept for hey, this new emerging thing is happening. I just think it's interesting to think about that history, because even if you look at it, like sometimes the people who are credited as inventing something are just part of like a really compelling narrative. Like I'm sure Benjamin Franklin was a really sharp guy. I'm not beefing on Ben.
Yeah.
I he's among my favorite bills.
Yeah.
He's the hundo.
Right.
Also known as the Benjamin, the titular.
Yeah.
But I would say the fact that Ben is credited with like the lightning rod, and I've heard maybe he invented electricity too while he's at it.
Yep.
Just because he's sort of, and I'm sure he was, again, the Franklin Institute. Please don't come at me.
This is like this is straight Ben Franklin.
I'm just
right
basically beefing on Ben.
Yeah.
It's Mike beefing on Ben. But it is interesting where like it's it comes back to the concept of the narrative. If you can
Right.
find like a good protagonist, a good sort of poster person for a concept, and people want to get behind that person as the inventor. It's like the discovery, the photos of the actual black hole that came out a couple of weeks ago is a very compelling story of a woman researcher who kind of pursued it, and then she became sort of the person associated with actually seeing a black hole, and that became very timely, so, and again, I'm not trying to beef her either, but it's the idea that like
Spitting fire on this episode.
there's curation and sort of constructing of narrative that happens in anything that even is purported to be purely factual in nature. So I guess I'm more fired up about this than I thought. This was exciting.
I guess so. I like the thought concept, just quickly here, about producing a piece of written work, let's say, and footnoting every single word.
Right.
Like thanking the contributor, like this comes from the old Germanic.
My kindergarten teacher, Miss Lacone, taught me.
But no, you got to go way back. You got to go way back like to the proto-humans,
the Goths and the Visigoths.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
I thank the Visigoths, like MLA style. I can see it here.
Yes.
But like it would have to be, to the point of carrying it out to absurdity. Like basically everything is borrowed in some way. I mean, I'm sure that there can be a counter example that can help prove the point, but basically everything is borrowed. And so I like the idea of a word by word citation, where and then you have to footnote the footnotes if you're not using words in those footnotes that that are footnoted elsewhere. It's going to be an infinite loop.
And I'd love to hear, I agree. And I'd love to hear what it's like to be a college professor or like a high school teacher grading papers, or like, how do you even address like a book report nowadays?
Got to thank the Chinese for the pen.
It's true.
I think they invented the pen.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's true. But like, so Dan, bring us home. What you got?
I think one, you're seeing a lot of technology try to aid teachers, right? To your question about plagiarism, there are a lot of websites that will let you run documents through it to try to see if it's cited correctly and gets it there. But I think the entire conversation is interesting and makes me think of things I've thought were my own joke or my own idea or my own social media posts. You see it all the time on Twitter. You're talking about the Thinkfluencer, which I did find many Thinkfluencers in the world by Googling it. But you think of that and you see on Twitter all the time where someone makes a joke and then someone else, do they steal the joke and then just get more interactions with them, more likes, more retweets, and thus they go viral? Or did two people have the same independent thought and post it to Twitter nearly at the same time, and just one person got more interactions? And so I think it's a petri dish of this sort of discussion of whether or not there's plagiarism or cryptomnesia, or if in fact it's just multiple discovery happening at the same time and going off to social media. Mike, great topic, one that's going to make me rethink things I've written in the past, things I've said in the past as well. Any final thoughts from you on the topic and how this may play forward as we discuss a variety of topics here in learning in 2019?
Yeah, just on a personal level, I wanted to fess up. I did a little research and I saw Jomo's been around since like 2011.
Oh no, Jomo.
Yeah, so I came up. I'm going to view it as multiple discovery. I don't think I saw that Jomo was out there. I think it's also replacing fear with joy is a smart move. So like, if there's anything that starts with fear, think about replacing it with joy, and maybe people will think you're a good.
Cape Joy. Does that work? Cape Joy.
Cape Joy, Cape Fear. Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
It all works. But then the related thing is FOMO, negative, JOMO, positive. I thought it was a good idea, but so did Katerina Fake, apparently. Although now that I'm reading this article, her name is Katerina Fake. So basically my point
lies upon lies.
You can't tell there is no truth. That was basically my final take. There is no truth, but cryptomnesia is a fun word, and feel free to use it liberally.
There is no truth. That's one way to end the episode. We're with you every Tuesday morning right here on Trending in Education. Thanks so much for listening. You can find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed, the same on Facebook, trendingineducation.com. I'd love to hear from all of you. Share this as well via your social media platforms, over on iTunes. Leave a rating, leave a comment. Love to read those and share them here on the show, and share us with a friend whenever you have an opportunity. Again, this is Trending in Education. Thanks so much for listening.